Welcome to Bedtime Express, your sanctuary for sleep and peaceful dreams. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a 3-hour journey through one of humanity's greatest adventures, the space race of 1960s. Before we begin, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're enjoying Bedtime Express, please like this video, leave a comment letting us know what you think, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future bedtime stories. Your support helps us create more of these peaceful journeys into sleep. Over the next few hours, you'll drift through the story of Sputnik, Gagarin, and the extraordinary moment when humans first set foot on the moon. This is not just history, it's a meditation on human achievement, wonder, and what we can accomplish when we dream big. Our narration is slow, gentle, and designed to guide you toward deep, restful sleep. Now, find yourself a comfortable position, dim the lights, and let yourself relax. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow your mind to drift as the story unfolds. There's nothing you need to do except breathe, relax, and prepare yourself for a night of peaceful sleep. The space race awaits. Let's begin. The space race. Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time. Close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself drift into a story of wonder, ambition, and humanity's greatest leap. This is the tale of the space race, a competition that transcended mere rivalry and became something far more profound, a collective dream of reaching toward the stars. It is a story of dedication, sacrifice, and the extraordinary things humans can accomplish when they dare to imagine the impossible. Let us travel now to a world transformed by the ending of a great war. The year is the 1950s, and two superpowers stand facing each other across an ideological chasm. The Soviet Union and the United States, allies in defeating fascism, have become locked in what historians call the Cold War. Tensions run deep, mistrust runs deeper, and the world holds its breath, wondering if conflict might erupt into something catastrophic. But in this tension, in this competition between two visions of the future, something remarkable was about to unfold. High above the earth, beyond the reach of armies and politics, lay the frontier of space. For centuries, humanity had gazed upward at the night sky, wondering what lay beyond the atmosphere that sustained life. But for most of human history, the stars remained distant, untouchable, reserved only for dreams and mythology. That was about to change, and change dramatically. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, made a bold decision. They would be the first nation to reach into space. They would prove the superiority of their system not through weapons or words, but through achievement, through reaching heights no human had ever reached before. This was not mere ambition. It was a statement, a declaration that would echo across the world and reshape the future of human civilization. On the 4th of October 1957, something extraordinary happened. High above the Soviet Union, a satellite began its journey around the Earth. It was small, a metal sphere barely larger than a beach ball, weighing merely 84 kilograms. Its name was Sputnik, a Russian word meaning traveling companion. This tiny sphere, circling the Earth every 96 minutes, carried with it the hopes and ambitions of a nation. Listen now to the sound of Sputnik's radio signal, beeping steadily as it orbited overhead. That simple beep, that rhythmic pulse transmitted from above, electrified the world. It meant that the barrier between Earth and space had finally been breached. The heavens, once the realm of God and gods, were now within reach of human technology and human will. Scientists and engineers around the world heard that beep with a mixture of wonder, fear, and fierce determination. In America, the reaction was immediate and profound. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into space, could they not launch weapons as well? The implications were staggering. President Eisenhower and his advisors understood that the space race was not merely about scientific achievement, it was about national security, national prestige, and the future of human civilization itself. The competition for space had begun, and neither nation could afford to fall behind. Picture now the frantic activity that began across America. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was created in 1958 to coordinate American efforts in space exploration. Brilliant minds from universities and laboratories were recruited for what would become humanity's greatest collective endeavor. Engineers, scientists, mathematicians, some of the finest minds of the age gathered with a shared purpose: to catch up to the Soviets and, if possible, to surpass them. The early days of space exploration were filled with excitement and uncertainty. No one knew what awaited in the vacuum above. Could a living creature survive in space? Would a human body be able to withstand the G-forces of launch and the weightlessness that awaited? These questions haunted the minds of those who were designing the spacecraft and planning the missions. The Soviets answered the question of animal survival first. In November of 1957, just weeks after Sputnik, they launched Sputnik 2. This satellite was far larger, and it carried something that had never been sent into space before, a living creature. Her name was Laika, a small dog from Moscow, and she became the first animal to orbit the Earth. Though Laika did not return alive, the technology for recovery had not yet been developed. Her mission provided crucial information about how living organisms respond to spaceflight. Consider the courage of that little dog, sleeping peacefully as she orbited the Earth, orbiting in the darkness of space, circling the world that had been her home. She was a pioneer, a herald of the age to come. Her sacrifice, though tragic by modern sensibilities, helped pave the way for human spaceflight. And so Laika became a symbol, not of Cold War conflict, but of the advancing frontiers of knowledge that both superpowers were pushing toward. The Americans, in the meantime, were preparing their own response. NASA was developing their Mercury program, which would be the first effort to send an American human into space. These early astronauts were selected from the ranks of military test pilots, brave men accustomed to danger and equipped with the skills needed to handle the unknown. They were heroes of a different sort, not warriors, but explorers, venturing into realms that no human had ever traversed. The competition between the two superpowers became fiercer with each passing month. The Soviets launched Sputnik 3, and America responded with Explorer 1. Each success by one side spurred the other to greater efforts. The world watched with bated breath, knowing that something momentous was unfolding, something that would define the age and reshape humanity's relationship with the cosmos. By 1961, both nations were ready to attempt the most audacious goal of all, sending a human being into space. The Soviets, still ahead in the space race, made their move first. On the 12th of April 1961, a young Soviet pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a small spherical capsule atop a rocket in Kazakhstan. He was 27 years old, courageous beyond measure, and about to become the first human to venture into the cosmos. As Gagarin's rocket lifted off, as it rose higher and higher into the thin air above Earth, something profound was happening. A human being, one of us, a man who had walked on the surface of Earth and breathed the air of our world, was now leaving the atmosphere behind. He was passing through the sky, through layers of clouds and wind, into the silence and darkness of space. For those aboard the spacecraft, and for those watching from Earth, it was a moment of transcendence, a threshold being crossed that could never again be uncrossed. Gagarin's journey lasted just 108 minutes, less than 2 hours. But in those 108 minutes, he orbited the Earth once, traveling faster than any human had ever traveled before, seeing the curvature of the Earth from above, witnessing a sight that only a handful of humans have ever seen. When he returned, parachuting down to the Soviet steppes, he was a hero, celebrated as the first human in space. And with Gagarin's achievement, the space race entered a new phase, a competition not merely for satellites or animals, but for the future of human spaceflight itself. 3 weeks later, on the 5th of May 1961, America answered with Alan Shepard. Shepard was an astronaut with the Mercury program, a man of courage and calm determination. His flight was shorter than Gagarin's, just 15 minutes in space, but it was enough to establish that an American could also venture into the cosmos and return safely. The space race between the two superpowers was now fully engaged, and both nations understood that the stakes were higher than anyone had previously imagined. As we enter the early 1960s, imagine now the fervent energy that gripped both nations. The space race was no longer a distant possibility or a distant dream. It was happening now, unfolding in real time before the eyes of the world. Every launch was a spectacle, every achievement a triumph, and every setback a bitter reminder of the stakes involved. The Americans understood that they were behind, and this knowledge drove them forward with fierce determination. Under the leadership of NASA Administrator James E. Webb and the brilliant engineer Wernher von Braun, a plan began to take shape. A plan so ambitious, so far-reaching, that it seemed almost impossible to those who heard it. America would not merely catch up to the Soviets. America would surpass them in a way so complete, so overwhelming, that it would establish once and for all the technological superiority of the American system. That plan had a name, Project Apollo, and its goal was breathtakingly simple and impossibly complex: to land a human being on the moon. When President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress on the 25th of May 1961, just weeks after Gagarin's flight and after Shepard's brief journey to the edge of space, he announced this goal to the American people. "I believe that this nation should commit itself," Kennedy said, "to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." These words, spoken with conviction and foresight, set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately reshape American society and capture the imagination of the entire world. It was an extraordinary commitment made not by a military commander or a space agency official, but by the President of the United States himself. Kennedy understood that the space race was not merely a competition between scientists and engineers. It was a competition between two ideologies, two visions of the future, two systems competing for the hearts and minds of people around the world. The moon, distant and untouched, became the ultimate prize. But before America could reach the moon, there were many smaller mountains to climb. There were lessons to be learned, technologies to be developed, and the mysteries of spaceflight to be unraveled one by one. The Mercury program continued, with astronauts venturing higher and staying longer in space with each mission. John Glenn orbited the Earth 3 times in 1962, a feat that thrilled Americans and proved that humans could not only survive in space, but could operate effectively there, conducting experiments and observations. Meanwhile, the Soviets were not idle. They were preparing their own ambitious programs, seeking to maintain their lead in the space race. In August of 1962, they launched Vostok 3 and Vostok 4, 2 spacecraft that flew in close proximity to each other, demonstrating that spacecraft could rendezvous in orbit. This was a crucial capability. If 2 spacecraft could fly close to each other, could they not dock transferring cosmonauts from one to the other? The implications were profound, and both nations understood the importance of this achievement. The middle years of the 1960s saw an intensification of the space race, like nothing that had come before. America developed the Gemini program, a series of missions designed to bridge the gap between the early Mercury flights and the eventual Apollo lunar landings. The Gemini spacecraft was larger than Mercury, capable of carrying 2 astronauts instead of 1. It was designed to accomplish 3 critical goals: long-duration spaceflight, spacecraft rendezvous and docking, and extravehicular activity, the ability of an astronaut to leave the spacecraft and work outside in the vacuum of space. Imagine the courage required of these early astronauts. They were venturing into an environment that was completely hostile to human life, an environment where a single suit breach, a single moment of negligence could result in death. And yet, mission after mission, they climbed into their spacecraft and rocketed skyward, driven by curiosity, by patriotism, and by the indomitable human spirit that seeks to explore and discover. In March of 1965, Alexei Leonov, a Soviet cosmonaut, made history by becoming the first human to walk in space. He floated outside his spacecraft, tethered by a lifeline, hovering in the darkness of the void, utterly alone between the Earth and the infinite cosmos above. It was a moment of profound courage and profound beauty, a human being alone in space, suspended between worlds. When Leonov's fingers brushed against the outside of his spacecraft, when he marveled at the sight of Earth hanging in the blackness below, he was experiencing something that no human had ever experienced before. But the spacewalk did not go without incident. Leonov's spacesuit inflated in the vacuum of space, making it difficult for him to move and to return to the airlock. Had he been unable to return, had the Soviet engineers not solved the problem, Leonov might have been stranded in the void, one of space exploration's first tragedies. But through quick thinking and problem solving, he made it back, and humanity learned another crucial lesson about operating outside spacecraft in space. Just 3 months later, in June of 1965, American astronaut Ed White performed America's first spacewalk during the Gemini 4 mission. Like Leonov, White floated outside his spacecraft, secured by a tether, gazing at the Earth below and the stars above. But where Leonov's spacewalk had been clouded by mechanical difficulties, White's was marked by grace and wonder. He maneuvered effortlessly in the weightless environment, and, when asked to return to the spacecraft, he reportedly said, "It's the saddest moment of my life." The beauty of space, the profound experience of floating in the void, had touched his soul in a way that transcended competition or politics. Throughout 1965 and into 1966, both nations continued their relentless push forward. The Gemini missions perfected the art of rendezvous and docking. Gemini 7 and Gemini 6 came within 1 foot of each other in orbit, a triumph of precision and engineering. Gemini 8 achieved the first successful docking between 2 spacecraft, a critical step toward the moon landing. American astronauts conducted multiple spacewalks, learning to work outside their spacecraft with confidence and skill. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, problems were beginning to surface. The program that had achieved so many firsts was facing challenges. Political infighting, budget constraints, and technical difficulties were slowing Soviet progress. The brilliant chief designer Sergei Korolev, who had conceived and built the Vostok and Voskhod spacecraft, was aging and his health was failing. The Soviet program, which had seemed invincible just a few years earlier, was beginning to stumble. America, by contrast, was accelerating. The United States had committed enormous resources to the space race. NASA's budget reached its peak in 1965, consuming more than 4% of the entire federal budget. Hundreds of thousands of workers, engineers, technicians, scientists, manufacturers were dedicated to the effort. Universities across America became centers of space-related research and education. The young people of America grew up watching launches and contemplating a future among the stars. And in the center of all this activity stood Wernher von Braun, one of the most remarkable figures of the age. Von Braun was a German engineer who had worked on rockets during World War II. After the war, he had been brought to America along with other German scientists and had dedicated his life to the development of American rocketry and space exploration. Von Braun was not merely an engineer, he was a visionary, a man who believed passionately in humanity's future in space. He could articulate the wonder and importance of space exploration to both scientists and to the general public. In von Braun's hands, the rocket became not just a weapon or a vehicle, but a key to unlocking the future. Von Braun had conceived of the Saturn V rocket, the largest and most powerful rocket ever built. The Saturn V stood 363 feet tall as a 36-story building, and weighed over 6 million pounds. When fully fueled, it contained more than 203,000 gallons of rocket fuel. To observers, the Saturn V was not merely an engineering achievement, it was a monument to human ambition, a towering expression of what humans could create when united by a common purpose. The Saturn V had 3 stages. The first stage, powered by 5 massive F1 engines, would lift the entire vehicle off the ground and accelerate it to a speed of 6,800 miles per hour before falling away into the Atlantic Ocean. The second stage would then fire, accelerating the spacecraft further, carrying it beyond the Earth's atmosphere and into the black sky of space. And finally, the third stage would fire, lifting the spacecraft and its precious human cargo out of Earth orbit and toward the Moon, 250,000 miles away. But before humans would ride the Saturn V, there was testing to be done. In 1966 and 1967, Saturn V rockets were launched unmanned, carrying spacecraft called Apollo spacecraft to the Moon and back. These test flights proved that the rocket could work, that the spacecraft could survive the journey, and that the technology for lunar exploration was within humanity's grasp. But tragedy struck on the 27th of January 1967. 3 American astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were sitting in an Apollo command module atop a Saturn IB rocket at Cape Kennedy. They were conducting a launch rehearsal test not meant to leave the ground when a fire broke out inside the capsule. In the high oxygen environment of the cabin, the fire spread with terrifying speed. The astronauts, unable to escape quickly enough, were overcome by smoke and flame. All 3 men died, and with them died some of the bright promise of the early space race. The loss was devastating. Ed White, who just months earlier had spoken so movingly of his spacewalk, was gone. Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee, dedicated professionals and brave explorers, would never journey into space again. The tragedy shook America and shook NASA. The investigations that followed revealed serious flaws in the design of the Apollo capsule, and significant changes had to be made. Progress on the lunar program slowed as engineers worked to make the spacecraft safer and more reliable. But the loss also hardened America's resolve. The nation grieved, but then it recommitted itself to the mission. If 3 brave men had died pursuing the dream of reaching the Moon, then that dream had to be achieved. To abandon the effort would be to render their sacrifice meaningless. And so, with sadness tempered by determination, America pressed forward, knowing that the path to the Moon would require patience, persistence, and continued sacrifice. The second half of the 1960s belonged to America. The momentum had shifted decisively. While the Soviet Union struggled with its own technical and political difficulties, the American space program surged forward with unprecedented energy and capability. The investments made, the sacrifices endured, the lessons learned from both successes and failures were all building toward a single monumental goal: the moon landing. In the autumn of 1968, America made its triumphant return to crewed spaceflight after the Apollo 1 disaster. The mission was called Apollo 7, and it carried astronauts Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walter Cunningham into orbit in a completely redesigned Apollo command module. The flight was cautious and deliberate, with every system carefully tested and verified. For 11 days, the 3 astronauts orbited the Earth, conducting experiments and proving that the Apollo spacecraft could work reliably and safely. It was not a spectacular mission, but it was profoundly important. It demonstrated that Americans could once again venture into space with confidence. Just 2 months later, in December of 1968, NASA made an extraordinarily bold decision. Apollo 8, which was originally planned as an Earth orbit test, would instead carry 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, all the way to the moon. They would not land on the lunar surface, but they would orbit the moon, circle around it, and see with their own eyes what no human had ever seen before: the far side of the moon, the lunar surface in intimate detail, and the view of Earth hanging in the black void of space as seen from the moon's orbit. The decision was risky. The spacecraft had not been tested to its full extent. The navigation systems that would be required to reach the moon and return safely were still being perfected. But NASA's leadership understood that the Soviets were preparing their own lunar missions, and America could not afford to fall behind. And so, with full awareness of the risks, they made the decision: Apollo 8 would go to the moon. On the 21st of December 1968, as the world prepared to celebrate Christmas, the Saturn V rocket carrying Apollo 8 lifted off from Cape Kennedy. 3 men sat atop a tower of flame and power, being accelerated faster and faster, leaving the Earth's atmosphere and beginning their journey across the void toward the moon. They were traveling faster than any human had ever traveled, reaching speeds of 35,000 miles per hour. They were leaving Earth's sphere of influence and venturing into the domain of another celestial body. For the first time in human history, humans were reaching beyond the Earth toward another world. 3 days of travel through the vacuum of space brought Apollo 8 to the moon. On Christmas Eve, the 24th of December 1968, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders entered lunar orbit, their spacecraft captured by the moon's gravity circling around it. And when they looked out their windows and saw the lunar surface below them, saw the craters and mountains and vast plains of the moon passing beneath them, they were seeing something that only a handful of humans had ever glimpsed. The journey that seemed impossible just years earlier was now reality. That Christmas Eve night, as families around the world celebrated together, the 3 astronauts circled the moon and looked back toward Earth. They saw our world hanging in the vast darkness of space, a small blue and white sphere floating in the infinite black void. And from their vantage point, 250,000 miles from home, they read from the book of Genesis to the world below, sharing a moment of spiritual reflection that transcended the Cold War competition that had sent them here. In the beginning, Frank Borman read, his voice calm and reverent, God created the heaven and the earth. The photograph that Bill Anders took that night became one of the most iconic images in human history. It showed the Earth, a small blue world, rising over the lunar horizon with the gray and lifeless surface of the moon in the foreground. That image captured something essential about the human journey it showed us. Our home from a distance revealed its fragility and its beauty, and reminded us that for all our differences and conflicts, we inhabit a single world together. The photograph came to be called Earthrise, and it became a symbol of the space age and of environmental consciousness alike. Apollo 8 returned to Earth on the 27th of December 1968, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean after a journey of 240,000 miles through space. The three astronauts emerged from their capsule alive and well, and the world rejoiced. The Americans had done it. They had reached the moon, orbited it, and returned safely, proving that such a journey was possible. The Soviets, who had planned their own crude lunar missions, were devastated. The race to the moon was still open, but America had taken the lead. Throughout the following months of 1969, NASA prepared for the final step of the Apollo program's initial mission, landing humans on the moon. 3 spacecraft would be involved in this mission. The Command and Service Module would remain in lunar orbit with 1 astronaut. The Lunar Module, a small, oddly shaped spacecraft that looked more like something from a science fiction film than a real machine, would descend to the lunar surface with 2 astronauts. The journey to the moon was being rehearsed by experienced crews. The technologies were being tested, and the moment was approaching when humans would finally set foot on another world. On the 16th of July 1969, in the pre-dawn darkness at Cape Kennedy, 3 astronauts prepared for their journey. Neil Armstrong, a skilled test pilot and the commander of the mission, would be the first human to walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, a brilliant engineer and decorated military officer, would be the second, and Michael Collins would remain in lunar orbit, commanding the spacecraft that would bring his companions home. All 3 men were intensely aware of the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. They understood that the eyes of the world would be upon them, that they were about to make history in a way that few humans ever could. The Saturn V rocket that would carry them was the largest rocket ever built, the most powerful engine of its time. Its engineers had checked and rechecked every system, every component, every line of code in its guidance computer. The rocket was an expression of human ingenuity and determination, a machine designed and built by hundreds of thousands of workers with the singular purpose of carrying 3 men to the moon and returning them safely to Earth. At 9:32 inches the morning, as spectators watched from the beaches of Florida and millions more watched on television around the world, the engines of the Saturn V ignited. The roar was deafening, a sound like nothing else in human experience. The rocket, burning fuel at a rate of 15 tons per second, began to rise. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, it lifted off the launch pad and climbed into the bright morning sky. For 2 minutes and 41 seconds, the first stage burned, lifting the entire vehicle to a height of 68 kilometers and a speed of 2.7 kilometers per second. Then the engine shut down. The first stage fell away, and the second stage ignited, continuing to accelerate the spacecraft towards space. 12 minutes after liftoff, the spacecraft was in Earth orbit, circling the planet at a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour, 190 kilometers above the surface. The astronauts, feeling weightless for the first time, looked down at the Earth below them, seeing it as only they could see it from the vantage point of space. The blue oceans, the green and brown land masses, the white swirls of clouds, the entire world was visible before them, a world that seemed somehow both infinitely large and infinitely small from this perspective. After 1.5 orbits around the Earth, with all systems checked and verified, the third stage of the Saturn V fired, accelerating the spacecraft away from Earth. This translunar injection burn lasted about 5 minutes and 48 seconds, and when it was complete, the spacecraft was traveling at 10.9 kilometers per second, fast enough to escape Earth's gravitational pull and travel to the Moon. The 3 astronauts were now committed to the journey. There was no turning back, no changing their minds, no possibility of aborting before reaching the Moon. They were truly venturing into the unknown, racing across the void toward another world. The journey to the Moon took 3 days. For 72 hours, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins traveled through the absolute vacuum of space, with nothing around them but the vast darkness, the distant stars, and the slowly growing crescent of the Moon ahead of them. They conducted experiments, took photographs, ate meals in weightlessness, food packaged specially for eating in space, and slept in shifts, taking turns monitoring the instruments that guided their spacecraft. On the 19th of July 1969, the spacecraft reached the Moon and fired its engines to enter lunar orbit. The 3 astronauts circled the Moon, observing the craters and mountains and valleys below them. They saw the Sea of Tranquility, a vast dark plain on the lunar surface where they would attempt to land. They saw mountains that rose miles into the thin lunar sky, shadows cast by the sunlight across the ancient landscape. The Moon, which had been an unreachable dream for all of human history, was now visible below them, waiting to be explored. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, a small spacecraft that looked nothing like any aircraft or spacecraft that had come before it. It had no aerodynamic shape, no streamlining, no concern for appearance. It was designed purely for function, purely for the task of descending to the Moon's surface and returning to orbit. It had a gold-tinted exterior that reflected the heat of the sun, and inside it was cramped and uncomfortable, with barely enough room for 2 astronauts in their spacesuits. But for Armstrong and Aldrin, stepping into the lunar module meant stepping into history. Michael Collins remained in the command module above, orbiting the moon alone, knowing that he would see wonders that only he would witness, knowing that he was part of something extraordinary, even as he remained apart from the mission's greatest moment. Collins was a philosopher and a poet, and he reflected deeply on what he was experiencing. He would later write about the profound loneliness and wonder of orbiting the moon alone, of knowing that Armstrong and Aldrin were below him, preparing to do what no human had ever done. On the surface of the Earth, billions of people waited and watched. The event was being broadcast live on television around the world. In homes and offices, in public squares and churches, people gathered to witness history. In the Soviet Union, even those who had been rivals in the space race felt the weight and wonder of what was about to happen. Humanity, divided as it was united in this moment, watching one of its own prepare to take a step that would echo through eternity. At 4:17 the afternoon, Houston time, on the 20th of July 1969, the lunar module began its descent. Armstrong was piloting the small spacecraft, guiding it down toward the lunar surface, while Aldrin monitored the instruments and called out altitude and velocity readings. The descent was not automated. There was no autopilot that could guarantee a safe landing, so Armstrong was flying the spacecraft by hand, making minute adjustments to the controls, guided by instruments and by his own instincts and training. Listen now to the voices of these 2 men as they communicated with Mission Control in Houston, Texas, 240,000 miles away. "Program alarm," Armstrong called out, his voice calm and steady as one of the spacecraft's computers flagged an issue. The engineers at Mission Control, led by Flight Director Gene Kranz, quickly determined that the alarm was not critical and that the descent could continue. Armstrong and Aldrin trusted these voices from Earth, these brilliant minds that had worked for years to make this moment possible. The lunar module descended lower and lower, dropping toward the surface at a speed of 150 meters per second. Fuel was being consumed rapidly, and Armstrong knew that he had a limited amount of time to find a suitable landing site. He had been aiming for the Sea of Tranquility, a vast plain on the moon's surface, but as he descended, he realized that the automated targeting system had selected a landing site surrounded by large boulders and craters. With only seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong made a split-second decision. He took manual control of the spacecraft and flew it forward, searching the lunar landscape below for a smooth, safe landing site. 60 seconds, a voice from Mission Control informed him, meaning that the lunar module had just 1 minute of fuel remaining. If Armstrong did not find a landing site within that minute, the spacecraft would run out of fuel and crash onto the moon. The tension in Mission Control was almost unbearable. The engineers watching the data streams, the flight directors monitoring the mission, the astronauts in the other spacecraft orbiting above all held their breath. The moment of triumph or tragedy was just seconds away. Then Armstrong spotted a suitable landing site, a relatively level area surrounded by gentler terrain. He piloted the lunar module toward it, descending at a slowing rate. The dust on the lunar surface, kicked up by the lunar module's descent engines, swirled around the spacecraft, obscuring Armstrong's view. He could barely see where he was landing. His hands were steady on the controls, his mind focused on the task before him, his years of training and decades of aviation history before the space age guiding his movements. 30 seconds, Mission Control called out. The fuel gauge showed that the lunar module was running dangerously low. There was almost no margin for error left. Armstrong was flying blind in a cloud of dust, trusting his instruments and his instincts, descending toward a world where no human had ever set foot. And then, with less than 30 seconds of fuel remaining, the spacecraft's landing legs touched the surface of the moon. The contact sensors detected the touch, and Armstrong knew that the lunar module had landed safely. "The Eagle has wings," Armstrong said calmly into his radio, using the lunar module's nickname to inform Mission Control that the landing had been successful. A moment later, he corrected himself. "The Eagle has landed." In Mission Control, engineers embraced, some weeping with joy and relief. On Earth, the news spread instantly around the world. Humans had landed on the moon. The impossible had become possible. The dream that had seemed so distant, so unattainable, had finally come true. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, living creatures from our world had traveled to another world and arrived safely. Armstrong and Aldrin, still in the lunar module, ran through checklist after checklist, verifying that all systems were functioning properly, that the spacecraft was stable and safe on the lunar surface. They did not immediately venture outside. Instead, they rested, slept for a few hours, allowing themselves to recover from the intensity of the landing. Armstrong in particular was exhausted. His heart rate had been elevated throughout the descent, his focus absolute, his concentration unwavering. But there was also the knowledge that the greatest moment of their lives was still to come. After several hours of rest and preparation, Armstrong and Aldrin began the process of putting on their spacesuits, massive, elaborate suits that would protect them from the vacuum of space, from the extreme temperatures of the lunar environment, from the radiation that would otherwise be lethal. The suits were works of engineering art, with multiple layers designed for insulation, protection, and mobility. Wearing them was like being enclosed in a small spacecraft, independent and self-contained, with their own oxygen supply, their own cooling system, their own communications equipment. At 10:50, 6 inches the evening, Houston time, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module and prepared to descend the ladder to the lunar surface. Michael Collins, orbiting above in the command module, watched the data streaming back to Earth, knowing that his two companions were about to do something that would change human history forever. Armstrong stepped onto the ladder and began to descend. Each rung was a step toward destiny, a step that no human had ever taken before. At 10:56, 15 inches the evening, Neil Armstrong's boot touched the surface of the moon, and as his foot made contact with the ancient dust and soil of another world, Armstrong spoke the words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The words were simple, poetic, and profound. In that moment, humanity had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. We were no longer confined to Earth. We had become a space-faring species, a species capable of leaving our home world and setting foot on another world. Armstrong stood on the moon, surrounded by a landscape of gray dust and dark rocks, beneath a black sky dotted with stars, and with the distant blue Earth hanging above the lunar horizon. He took a few steps, testing his movement in the lower gravity of the moon, where gravity is only 1/6 as strong as on Earth. He moved in a bouncing gait, each step a small leap, each motion graceful and otherworldly. He was experiencing something no human had ever experienced, the sensation of moving on the surface of another world, of being the first human to stand on the moon. The loneliness of that moment must have been overwhelming, and yet also profoundly moving. He was utterly alone on the lunar surface, but connected by radio to Earth, to millions and billions of people watching, waiting, marveling at what they were witnessing. 19 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin descended the ladder and joined Armstrong on the lunar surface. When Aldrin's boot touched the moon, Armstrong greeted him with the words, "Beautiful view, magnificent desolation." The two astronauts stood together on the moon, two representatives of humanity standing on a world that had never been visited by living beings before. They walked across the lunar surface, collecting rock samples, deploying scientific experiments, photographing everything they saw. Armstrong took pictures of Aldrin, and Aldrin took pictures of Armstrong, and together they created a photographic record of this most extraordinary achievement. As Armstrong and Aldrin worked on the lunar surface, they made observations and descriptions that were broadcast live to Earth. They described the landscape as gently rolling terrain with craters of various sizes. They noted how the surface was composed of fine, powdery dust that clung to their suits. They collected samples of rocks and soil, placing them in specially designed bags to be brought back to Earth for analysis. They set up a flag, the American flag, on the lunar surface, planting it firmly in the dust as a symbol of the achievement and as a marker for future explorers. When they placed the flag, it stood upright, held in position by a wire frame, so that it would appear to be waving, even though there was no wind on the airless moon. Armstrong and Aldrin spent 2 hours and 31 minutes on the lunar surface, walking and exploring, conducting experiments and gathering samples. But those 2.5 hours represented something far more significant than the time spent or the distances covered. They represented the fulfillment of a dream that had haunted humanity for centuries. They represented the culmination of decades of work by hundreds of thousands of dedicated professionals. They represented the technological and intellectual achievement of an entire civilization. When it came time to leave, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed back up the ladder and entered the lunar module. They sealed the hatch and prepared for ascent. The ascent stage of the lunar module had to launch perfectly, had to achieve the correct velocity and trajectory to reach the orbit where the command module was waiting for them. If something went wrong, if the engines failed to fire, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the moon with no way to return to Earth. But the engineers at NASA had checked and rechecked every system, every component, and they had confidence that the ascent would succeed. At 1:54 inches the afternoon, on the 21st of July 1969, the engines of the lunar module's ascent stage ignited, pushing the small spacecraft upward from the lunar surface. The ascent was rapid and powerful, carrying Armstrong and Aldrin away from the moon and toward the orbit where Michael Collins waited in the command module. The two modules linked up in orbit, and Armstrong and Aldrin transferred back to the command module, carrying with them the precious samples of lunar material, 47 kilograms of rocks and soil that would be studied by scientists for years to come. The lunar module was then jettisoned, left in lunar orbit where it eventually crashed to the surface. The journey back to Earth took 3 more days. On the 24th of July 1969, the command module re-entered Earth's atmosphere, burning with the heat of friction, slowing from a speed of 11 kilometers per second to a gentle splash landing in the Pacific Ocean. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins emerged from the capsule, alive and well, and were recovered by a waiting spacecraft. They had journeyed to the moon and returned safely, and in doing so, they had captured the imagination and admiration of the entire world. The return of the Apollo 11 astronauts marked a turning point, not just in the space race, but in human consciousness itself. On the night of July 20 and 21, 1,969 billions of people around the world shared a collective experience. They watched as humans set foot on another world, and in watching, they participated in something transcendent, something that transcended national boundaries, political ideologies, and cultural differences. For a moment, a shining, perfect moment, humanity seemed unified in wonder and achievement. The three astronauts returned to Earth as heroes, celebrated not just in America but around the world. They were invited to parades and ceremonies. They received honors and accolades. They were mobbed by crowds of admirers wherever they went. Armstrong, with his measured demeanor and his poetic words, became the most famous human in the world. Aldrin, with his scientific background and his enthusiasm, was celebrated as the second person to walk on the moon. And Collins, though he had not set foot on the lunar surface, was recognized for his crucial role in the mission, for his solo orbit of the moon, and for his readiness to rescue his companions had something gone wrong. But the moon landing was not an end, it was a beginning. NASA and the world understood that the achievement of Apollo 11 was just the first step in lunar exploration. 5 more missions were planned to land humans on the moon, to explore different regions, to gather more samples, to conduct more experiments, to push the boundaries of human spaceflight even further. In November of 1969, just 4 months after Apollo 11, Pete Conrad and Alan Bean landed on the moon during the Apollo 12 mission. Apollo 12 landed with remarkable precision just a few hundred meters from the Surveyor 3 spacecraft, an unmanned probe that had landed on the moon years earlier. Conrad and Bean spent more than 7 hours on the lunar surface, conducting more extensive exploration than Armstrong and Aldrin had done. They collected 34 kilograms of samples and deployed more sophisticated scientific equipment. Richard Gordon, the third member of the crew, orbited above in the command module, and together the 3 men demonstrated that the moon landing had not been a one-time miracle, but the beginning of a sustained program of lunar exploration. The Soviet Union, which had been so far ahead in the space race just years earlier, was now falling behind in the most important competition of all. The Soviets had planned their own crewed lunar landing, but technical difficulties, budget constraints, and political upheaval had derailed their efforts. The chief designer, Sergei Korolev, the brilliant mind behind Soviet spaceflight, had died in January of 1966 after complications from surgery. Without Korolev's visionary leadership and organizational skill, the Soviet program had fragmented. Multiple design bureaus worked on competing lunar programs, and without a unified direction, the Soviets could not achieve the coordination and resources necessary to succeed. In December of 1968, the Soviets had launched Zond 5, an unmanned spacecraft that flew around the moon and returned to Earth, proving that the technology for a crewed lunar flight existed in the Soviet Union as well. But they never took the final step of sending cosmonauts to the moon. Whether the decision was political, an acknowledgement that they had been beaten in the race, or technical, related to continuing problems with their lunar spacecraft, the Soviet Union chose not to pursue crewed lunar missions. The most dramatic competition of the space race had been decided, and America had won. But the victory meant something different than what the architects of the space race had imagined. President Kennedy had initiated the moon race as a demonstration of American superiority, as a proof that capitalism and democracy were superior to communism and authoritarianism. And certainly, the achievement of landing humans on the moon was a tremendous accomplishment, a vindication of American technology and American determination. But as the decade of the 1960s drew to a close, and as the early 1970s approached, something was shifting in American consciousness and in the consciousness of the world. The achievement of the moon landing had revealed something unexpected to many observers. It showed that humans were capable of extraordinary things when united by a common purpose, but it also raised profound questions about priorities and values. As the spacecraft traveled to the moon and back, as astronauts looked down at the Earth from 250,000 miles away, observers around the world began to ask questions. Why were we spending such enormous resources to reach the moon when there was poverty and suffering on Earth? Is less than #0. 5 is greater than. Why were we focused on space when we had environmental problems to solve, social problems to address, inequities to remedy? The photograph called Earthrise, taken during the Apollo 8 mission by Bill Anders, became a symbol not of American achievement, but of environmental consciousness. The fragile blue world hanging in the vastness of space, with no visible national boundaries, with no signs of the conflicts that divided us, seemed to suggest that our true home, our true priority, should be the Earth itself. The environmental movement, which was gaining momentum in the late 1960s, adopted the image as an icon. "We are all passengers on Spaceship Earth," the slogan went, "and we need to take care of it." Public support for the space race began to wane after the Apollo 11 mission. The tremendous investment in NASA, which had peaked in 1965, began to decline. Congress, responding to changing public opinion, began to question whether the money being spent on space exploration was justified. Budgets were cut, and while the remaining Apollo missions continued, they were given less resources and less public attention than the earlier missions had received. There was also a tragic reminder of the dangers of spaceflight. In April of 1970, Apollo 13, commanded by Jim Lovell, was on its way to the moon when an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. The explosion damaged the spacecraft critically, threatening the lives of all 3 astronauts, Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert. The mission to land on the moon was aborted, and instead all efforts turned toward bringing the astronauts home safely. The 3 men had to shelter in the lunar module, using it as a lifeboat, while engineers and astronauts on Earth worked frantically to solve the problems and chart a course for a safe return. For 4 harrowing days, the world watched and waited. The 3 astronauts, though in danger, remained calm and professional, working with mission control to troubleshoot the problems and navigate the spacecraft back to Earth. Jim Lovell spoke the now famous words, "Houston, we've had a problem." Those words, spoken with calm understatement in the face of life-threatening danger, became emblematic of the professionalism and courage of the astronauts and the engineers who supported them. Eventually, through the combined efforts of the astronauts in space and the engineers on Earth, a solution was found. The spacecraft was brought home, and on the 17th of April 1970, the command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean with all 3 astronauts alive. It was, as Lovell would later describe it, a successful failure. The mission to land on the moon had failed, but the mission to save the lives of the 3 astronauts had succeeded. The incident reminded the world of the risks of spaceflight, but it also demonstrated the resilience, ingenuity, and determination of those involved in the space program. Despite the accidents and setbacks, the Apollo program continued. In February of 1971, Alan Shepard, the same astronaut who had made America's first spaceflight in 1961, just weeks after Gagarin returned to space as the commander of Apollo 14. Shepard, now 47 years old, descended to the lunar surface and, in one of the more light-hearted moments of the Apollo program, hit 2 golf balls on the moon, joking that one of them went miles and miles and miles. The image of an astronaut hitting golf balls on another world captured the imagination of people around the globe and helped to reignite interest in the space program. Apollo 15, 16, and 17 followed over the next 2 years, each mission exploring different regions of the moon, each mission conducting more sophisticated experiments, each mission pushing the boundaries of what humans could accomplish beyond Earth. The later Apollo missions used the Lunar Roving Vehicle, a small electric automobile that allowed the astronauts to explore areas far from the landing site, to travel several kilometers across the lunar surface, to conduct geological surveys and sample collection operations that would have been impossible on foot. By the time Apollo 17 concluded in December of 1972, humanity had achieved something extraordinary. 12 men had walked on the moon. They had left footprints in the lunar dust, footprints that will remain unchanged for millions of years, since there is no wind on the moon to erase them, no geological processes to alter them. These footprints are monuments to human achievement, to the courage and determination of explorers and the dedication of those who supported them. The moonwalkers had collected 382 kilograms of samples, rocks, and soil that scientists have been studying for more than 50 years, learning about the composition of the moon, its history, the processes that formed it. They had deployed scientific instruments that, in some cases, continued to transmit data back to Earth for years after the missions ended. They had photographed the lunar landscape in detail, creating a comprehensive record of the lunar surface that remains valuable to scientists and explorers alike. But perhaps most importantly, the moonwalkers had demonstrated something profound about humanity. They had shown that we are capable of achieving goals that seem impossible, of transcending the limitations that nature appears to impose on us, of reaching beyond our home world and exploring other worlds. The image of humans on the moon, walking in the vacuum of space, conducting experiments, collecting samples, and experiencing the wonder of being on another world, became a symbol of human potential and human possibility. After Apollo 17, no more humans ventured to the moon. The space race, which had driven the lunar missions, had essentially concluded with the American achievement of landing humans on the moon. The Soviet Union had chosen not to pursue crewed lunar missions, and America, having achieved the primary goal that President Kennedy had articulated, saw no compelling reason to continue at the previous pace. The enormous costs of the Apollo program could not be sustained indefinitely, and public support for space exploration had begun to shift toward other priorities. The end of the space race, however, did not mean the end of human spaceflight. Rather, it meant a transformation in the nature of that spaceflight. The focus shifted from competing superpowers attempting to beat each other to the moon, to collaboration and cooperation, to sustained programs of Earth orbit operations. And so we arrive at the culmination of our journey through the space race, not at an ending, but at a transformation. The race to reach the moon had been won by America, but what had humanity truly gained in that victory? What had changed in the world because 12 men had walked on the moon? What lasting impact did the space race have on human civilization? These are questions worth pondering as we reflect on this remarkable period in human history. The most obvious legacy of the space race was technological. The development of rockets powerful enough to reach the moon, of spacecraft capable of sustaining human life in the harsh environment of space, of computers and navigation systems capable of guiding vehicles across the vast distances between Earth and Moon. These represented quantum leaps in human technology. The technologies developed for the space program spawned innovations that improved life on Earth. Memory foam, originally developed for spacesuits, found applications in mattresses and comfort products. Water purification systems designed for spacecraft were adapted for use in homes and communities around the world. Telecommunications satellites, the descendants of the early space program efforts, revolutionized global communication and remain central to how we connect with each other today. The computer technology developed for the space program was particularly significant. The computers in Apollo spacecraft, revolutionary for their time, drove advances in computing that accelerated the development of modern digital technology. The miniaturization required to fit computers into spacecraft led to innovations in semiconductor design and manufacturing that benefited the broader computer industry. In this way, the space program contributed to the digital revolution that has so profoundly shaped modern civilization. But beyond the technological legacy, the space race had a profound cultural and intellectual impact. The achievement of landing humans on the moon captured the imagination of millions, perhaps billions of people around the world. Young people who watched the moon landing on television, who saw humans walking on another world, were inspired to pursue careers in science, engineering, and mathematics. The Apollo generation of scientists and engineers, those who grew up dreaming of space and committed themselves to space exploration and to technical fields generally, helped drive advances in countless fields. Universities across America and around the world experienced a surge in enrollment in science and engineering programs in the decade following the Apollo 11 landing. Young women and men who might otherwise have pursued different paths were drawn to these fields by the inspiration and wonder of the space program. Some of them went on to contribute to the space program itself. Others took the skills and knowledge they developed in space, related fields, and applied them to other domains, to medicine, to environmental science, to energy development, to countless other fields that benefit from technological innovation and rigorous scientific thinking. The space race also had profound philosophical and spiritual implications. The photograph of Earth taken from space, the Earthrise image from Apollo 8, and later the blue marble photograph from Apollo 17, profoundly changed how humans thought about their home world. Seeing Earth as a single, unified world without visible national boundaries, suspended in the vastness of space, had a transformative effect on human consciousness. It fostered a sense of global unity and planetary consciousness that had been absent before. Environmental activists adopted the image as a symbol of the fragility and interconnectedness of life on Earth. Spiritual leaders and philosophers used the image to reflect on humanity's place in the cosmos and our responsibility to each other and to our planet. The space race also demonstrated the power of human cooperation and coordination on a vast scale. The Apollo program involved hundreds of thousands of workers, engineers, scientists, technicians, manufacturers, administrators working together toward a common goal. Companies and universities from around America and indeed around the world contributed to the effort. The Saturn V rocket was not designed or built by a single company or institution, but by a vast network of organizations and individuals, all working toward the same objective. This demonstrated that when humanity can align its efforts, when we can overcome our divisions and work together for a shared purpose, we are capable of achieving extraordinary things. Is less than #2. Zero hash is greater than. At the same time, the space race had highlighted the absurdities and tragedies of competition between superpowers. The enormous resources devoted to reaching the moon could have been applied to countless other problems: poverty, disease, environmental degradation. The fact that the primary motivation for the space race was political competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, rather than a unified human desire to explore, was not lost on observers even at the time. Some critics argued then, and continue to argue now, that the resources devoted to the space program would have been better spent on social programs and addressing human suffering. Yet it is also worth considering that perhaps the space race was both a competition driven by Cold War tensions and simultaneously an expression of the deepest human impulses to explore, to discover, to push beyond our limitations. The competition between nations, while not the ideal motivation, nonetheless mobilized resources and talent on a scale that might not have been possible otherwise. In a very real sense, the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, for all its dangers and tensions, also produced one of humanity's greatest achievements: the exploration of space and the landing of humans on the moon. After the conclusion of the Apollo program, spaceflight entered a new era. Rather than competing to reach the moon, the United States and the Soviet Union eventually began to cooperate in space. The Space Shuttle, developed by America, and the space stations Salyut and Mir, developed by the Soviet Union, became the focal points of space operations. Eventually, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia and America worked together to build the International Space Station, a project of unprecedented international cooperation, with scientists and engineers from around the world working together to maintain a permanent human presence in Earth orbit. The memory of the space race, particularly the achievement of the moon landing, has become embedded in human culture and consciousness. The names of the astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and the others have become synonymous with human achievement and heroism. The image of an astronaut in a spacesuit on the lunar surface, the American flag planted on the moon, the photographs of the spacecraft against the black sky of space, these have become iconic images that represent the highest aspirations of human civilization. Yet there is also a certain poignancy in reflecting on the space race, because what followed was not a sustained commitment to space exploration, but a retreat from it. After 1972, no human has ventured to the moon in the more than 50 years that have elapsed since then. The Space Shuttle program, which began in 1981, was designed to provide routine access to space, but it proved to be more expensive and dangerous than proponents had hoped. Space exploration has continued, but at a much slower pace, with fewer resources and with less of the sense of urgency and grand vision that characterized the space race era. Some observers have lamented this retreat from space, viewing it as a loss of vision and ambition on humanity's part. Others have argued that space exploration, while valuable, should be a lower priority than addressing problems on Earth. The debate between these perspectives continues to this day, and reasonable people can disagree about the priorities and about the resources that should be devoted to space exploration versus other endeavors. And yet, even as human spaceflight slowed, robotic exploration of space accelerated. Unmanned spacecraft have traveled to every planet in the solar system and beyond. Rovers have explored the surface of Mars, seeking evidence of past water and past life. Telescopes in orbit around Earth have peered deeper into the universe than any Earth-based telescope could, revealing the structure of the cosmos and the billions of galaxies that populate the universe. Spacecraft have visited asteroids and comets and returned samples of material from space to Earth for scientific analysis. In many ways, the dream of exploring space that was ignited by the space race has not dimmed but has been transformed, expressed now through robotic exploration as much as through human spaceflight. In recent years, there has been a renewed interest in returning humans to the moon. NASA has announced plans to return to the moon with missions called Artemis, which are named after the twin sister of Apollo in Greek mythology. These missions will land humans on the moon in the 21st century, establishing a sustained presence there and using the moon as a stepping stone for eventual human missions to Mars and beyond. Other nations, including China and India, have also been developing lunar programs. Private companies, inspired by the vision of space exploration and driven by commercial motives, have entered the realm of spaceflight and are developing their own capabilities for reaching space and for providing services to both government and private customers. This represents a fundamental shift in how humanity approaches space exploration. Where once the space race was dominated by two superpowers competing with each other, space exploration has now become a more distributed endeavor involving multiple nations and private enterprises working sometimes in competition and sometimes in cooperation. This democratization of space access may ultimately prove even more significant than the space race itself, opening the door to a future in which access to space is no longer the exclusive domain of government agencies, but becomes accessible to entrepreneurs, scientists, and eventually to ordinary people. The space race of the 1960s was a unique moment in human history. It occurred at a specific time, in a specific context, driven by specific motivations that may never be replicated exactly. The Cold War competition between superpowers, the availability of vast resources, the technological developments that made space travel possible, the visionary leadership that articulated ambitious goals. All these factors came together in a particular moment to create something extraordinary. We cannot simply recreate the space race in our own time, nor should we want to, for it was driven by tensions and motivations that we would prefer to transcend. Yet the fundamental achievements and lessons of the space race remain eternally relevant. The fact that humans reached the moon demonstrates that we are capable of accomplishing goals that seem impossible, that we can overcome obstacles through determination and cooperation, that we can achieve visions that inspire us even when those visions seem far beyond our reach. The space race shows that when we commit ourselves to a shared goal, when we combine our talents and resources, when we are willing to do the hard work and take the necessary risks, we can accomplish extraordinary things. The technology that reached the moon also reminds us of something else, that technology is not inherently good or bad, but that its value depends on how we choose to use it. The same rockets that carried humans to the moon could have been instruments of destruction. Instead, they became instruments of exploration and discovery. The choice to use them for reaching toward the stars rather than for warfare or destruction reflects values and priorities that we consciously or unconsciously embrace. In our own time, as we develop new technologies, we face similar choices about how those technologies will be used and what values they will serve. The photographs of Earth taken from space during the space race have also profoundly influenced how we think about environmental issues and global cooperation. Seeing our planet from the perspective of space, seeing it as a single unified world without visible national boundaries, has helped foster a sense of global consciousness and environmental awareness. This perspective reminds us that we all share a common home, that the well-being of each of us is interconnected with the well-being of all of us, and that we have a shared responsibility to protect and preserve our planet. This realization, though it did not solve the world's problems, has contributed to the development of environmental movements and to a growing recognition that humanity faces global challenges that require global cooperation. And so, as we conclude our meditation on the space race, let us reflect on what the great achievement of the 1960s and early 1970s teaches us about ourselves and about our possible futures. The space race teaches us that we are creatures capable of extraordinary vision and extraordinary accomplishment. It teaches us that competition, while it can be destructive, can also be channeled toward constructive ends that benefit all of humanity. It teaches us that cooperation and coordination on vast scales is possible when we have clear goals and shared purpose. It teaches us that inspiration and wonder are powerful forces that can motivate people to achieve great things. And it teaches us that the pursuit of grand visions and ambitious goals can transform not just individuals, but entire societies. As you lie in the comfort of your bed, As you prepare to drift towards sleep, allow yourself to imagine the wonder that those early space explorers must have felt. Imagine the perspective of looking back at Earth from space, seeing our home from a distance that reveals both its beauty and its fragility. Imagine the courage of those who climbed into spacecraft, knowing they were venturing into the unknown, knowing the risks they were taking, yet proceeding anyway because they were motivated by curiosity, by ambition, and by the desire to explore. Imagine the satisfaction of the engineers and scientists who designed and built the spacecraft and rockets, who solved problems, overcame obstacles, and contributed their skills and talents to something greater than themselves. The space race stands as a monument to what humans can accomplish when we believe in possibility, when we work together toward shared goals, when we are willing to commit resources and energy to something that seems to transcend immediate practical benefit. It stands as a reminder that we are not limited to what we have already achieved, that the future can be greater than the past, that possibilities exist that we have not yet imagined. The moon, once unreachable, became within reach through human determination and ingenuity. And if we reached the moon, what else might we reach? What other mountains might we climb? What other worlds might we explore? What other goals might we achieve if we maintain the vision and dedication that the space race exemplified? These questions accompany us as we drift towards sleep, as we leave the waking world and journey into dreams. The space race becomes not just a historical event, but a mirror in which we see reflected both what we have been capable of and what we might yet become. The astronauts who walked on the moon became symbols not just of national achievement, but of human achievement, of the heights that the human spirit can reach when motivated by wonder, courage, and determination. And so, dear listener, as we conclude our journey through these remarkable years of the 1960s and early 1970s, allow yourself to drift peacefully into sleep, carrying with you the memory of those distant days when humanity reached for the stars and achieved that reach. Remember that the same species that built the rockets and flew to the moon lives on in our world today, lives on in us. The capacity for vision, for determination, for cooperation, for achievement that manifested so powerfully during the space race remains part of our human heritage, available to us whenever we choose to awaken it, whenever we choose to pursue ambitious goals, whenever we choose to believe that the impossible might be made possible. Sleep well now, knowing that you are part of a species that has looked toward the stars and has reached them, that has dared to dream great dreams and has achieved those dreams, that has transcended the boundaries that nature seemed to impose and has ventured into the void of space itself. The space race reminds us that we are not limited by the present, that the future is open and full of possibility, that what we choose to accomplish depends ultimately on the choices we make and the commitments we maintain. Rest peacefully in that knowledge, and may your dreams take you to worlds yet unexplored, to heights yet unscaled, to futures yet unimagined. The story of the space race is ultimately a story about the human spirit and its capacity to transcend limitations, to reach beyond the familiar, to dare greatly. It is a story that speaks to something deep within all of us, a desire to explore, to discover, to venture into the unknown in pursuit of knowledge and understanding. That desire, that spark of curiosity and courage, remains alive in each of us, waiting to be awakened, waiting to inspire us toward our own great achievements, whatever form those achievements might take. And so we close the book on these remarkable decades, these years when humanity reached toward the moon and achieved that reach. We close the book, but we do not close our minds or our hearts to the lessons and inspirations that the space race offers. Those lessons remain alive, those inspirations remain available, and the possibility of achieving great things remains open to us. Now, as in the days when the rockets first rose toward the sky and carried our species toward the stars. Sleep now, dear listener, and rest assured that the dream of space, the wonder of exploration, the possibility of human achievement remains eternally part of who we are and what we might become. May you sleep peacefully, may you dream of distant stars and far worlds, and may you awake refreshed and inspired by the reminder that we are creatures capable of greatness, creatures who have looked toward infinity and dared to venture there.